Before beginning, I wanted to recommend some great podcasts that are available now on Stitcher Premium. If you're like me and you enjoy true crime, then make sure to check out True Crime Garage Off the Record, the latest project from True Crime Garage hosts Nick and the Captain. Each week they revisit some of the most haunting cases they've covered so far. Or, if you're looking for something different, comedian Chris Garrett's Beautiful Stories from Anonymous People opens the phone line to one anonymous caller, and Chris can't hang up first, no matter what. From shocking confessions and family secrets to philosophical discussions and shameless self-promotion, anything can and will happen. You can also enjoy completely ad-free episodes of hit shows like Dr. Death and American History Tellers from the Wondery Network, or Cults and Serial Killers from the Parcast Network. To get a free month trial of Stitcher Premium, go to stitcherpremium.com and use promo code TALES. That's stitcherpremium.com and promo code TALES.
This podcast contains material of a violent and disturbing nature. It is not suited for all audiences.
Welcome to episode 13 of Horror Tales, a podcast in which you can sit back and listen to a scary story. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm the producer of Horror Tales. Today's story was written by C.M. Mueller and is part of his collection Hidden Folk. It is narrated by Allyson Latondress, featuring Seth and Joe Joveland. The sound design and music are as always produced by myself. It is called The Dust Child.
Oliver had his first glimpse of the Dust Child 2 weeks after his mother started receiving treatments. Per his usual after-school routine, he peeked into the dim interior of her room, startled to discover a presence looming at her side. As the thing shifted its gaze toward his prying eyes, specks of dust began drifting from its ill-defined skull. Pushing the door wide, Oliver watched its slender body distort under the sudden influx of air and begin to rapidly dissipate. By the time he reached the bed to clasp his mother's hand, it was gone. Most days after checking in on his mother, who at this stage was still capable of taking care of herself, even though she rarely ventured from the bed, Oliver would retreat to his room to read until his father returned from work. But on this particular occasion, he remained at her side, figuring that doing so would prevent the Dust Child's return. In a way, it had brought him closer to her, encouraged a kindness and a closeness that, since her physical change, he had avoided more often than not. The treatments had taken so much from her, and it pained him to witness her daily metamorphosis. Her hair had started falling out, and on most mornings he awoke to the sound of her crying in the bathroom as she showered. But now, Oliver found solace in her restful countenance. She had always been there for him, always made him feel loved, and he wanted nothing more than for things to return to the way they had been. As she began to cry, he tightened his grip on her hand, stroking its bony surface with his thumb. He glanced to the spot near the window where the Dust Child had been, mesmerized by the ever-shifting particles, curious and yet petrified to know their origin. He must have been staring longer than he thought, for when he turned his attention back to his mother, he was startled to discover she had awoken and was studying his own features as though for the first time. as though he and the newborn he had once been were one and the same. She was smiling, and he could not help but mimic the expression, believing she had miraculously overcome her sickness and was beginning to heal. From that day onward, Oliver dusted his mother's room without fail every day after school. And even though he knew it was impossible to remove each speck of dust, he did his best, often repeating the process 2 or 3 times to make certain the majority had been removed. It hadn't even occurred to him until a few days in that the floor, and in particular the space beneath the bed, hadn't been cleaned in months. The thought of all that dust collected in the carpet's fibers unnerved him as he walked its surface, and when he peeked beneath the bed and saw the dirt-like accumulation there, he felt sick to his stomach. By the week's end, however, Oliver began to realize the hopelessness of his efforts. As thorough as he had been, the dust seemed bound and determined to outwit his due diligence. He'd swipe one surface and move on to the next, only to look back and find that the dust had reaccumulated, giving the impression of month-long neglect. As he stared in disbelief, he could sense the dust child watching him from the shadows of the room, silently snickering and waiting for the appropriate moment to reappear, to force him into a corner and blow the dust in his face.
Ollie, what's going on in here?
He turned to find his father standing in the doorway, his work tie loosened into an inverted noose. This had not been the first instance Oliver had lost track of time. Normally, reading was the culprit, but now it was the dust, or the task of its removal, that swept time away. Without a word, he walked past his father to the end of the hall, far enough from the room so as not to disturb his resting mother. His father was quick to follow, asking if everything was okay.
I just thought I'd do a little cleaning for Mom is all.
His father smiled, ruffling his hair.
That's very thoughtful of you, Ollie. We're going to make it through this. I promise.
Part of Oliver wanted to tell about his experience with the dust child, but another part knew that his father would likely insinuate that he had been reading too many imaginative books as of late. In the hall, away from the room, Oliver nearly convinced himself that this was the case. Upon waking the following morning, Oliver sensed something amiss. His dreams had been filled not only with dust, but a smothering sensation as well. Still clad in his pajamas, he strode to his mother's room, pausing to listen to the heavy snores emanating from the living area. Lately, his father had been spending a lot of time on the couch, watching TV after work, falling asleep there late at night. Oliver opened the door a comfortable 2 inches, enough to peek inside. The dust child was waiting for him.
Get away,
he said, his voice full of whispered fury.
Leave her alone.
But the thing stood its ground, continuing to study his mother. The movement of its head was methodical, like a surgeon contemplating a specific task.
I'm coming in to clean, so you better leave now.
Striding to the dresser, Oliver located the rag he had set there yesterday. He bravely inched closer to the intruder.
I'm not afraid of you, you know. Not one bit.
He was not staring at the dust child when he said this, but at the barely discernible reflection of himself in the dresser's unlit surface.
You're nothing but dust anyway.
With these words, Oliver found the courage to turn. But the dust child was gone. Later that morning, not long after breakfast, Oliver started vacuuming the room. He used each nozzle, collecting as much dust as he could from the sides of the furniture, baseboards, and beneath the bed. His meticulousness surprised and delighted his mother, who had awoken and propped herself up to watch the proceedings with a prideful smile, motioning for him to turn off the vacuum. "You're going through too much trouble, dear. I don't mind a bit of dust." Seeing his mother sitting up heartened Oliver, for part of his rationale for cleaning, aside from starving out the dust child, had to do with speeding up her recovery. He figured the cleaner and more organized he kept her room, the sooner she might be made whole again. But all this work was for naught, for later that afternoon, not long after his father had left for the grocery store, the dust child reappeared. With its return came a renewed boldness. It wanted to be seen, wanted to share its secrets. And even though its featureless face was incapable of forming a sinister grin, Oliver sensed it was taunting him, worse than any bully at school. Bracing for the worst, he strode to the opposite side of the bed, his gaze fixed on the manifestation, asking what it wanted, why it had chosen his mother. The thing turned dispassionately in his direction, as though it could see. But making eye contact or attempting to communicate had never been its objective. It wanted an audience, wanted Oliver to come in close and observe. And he did, staring in horrified disbelief as the dust child moved its fingerless right arm in a precise and fluid motion toward his mother's chin, watched as the stub of this simple appendage reformulated into a tube, an impossibly configured siphon that eased its way into the anemic mouth, pulsing as regular as his own heart. Watched as the thing's body grew more dense with the essence of his mother. That the dust child was feeding, Oliver had no doubt. And it was consuming its host faster than any cancer could. Nearly every afternoon, after arriving home from school, Oliver would find the dust child waiting for him. Only when it became aware of his presence would it insert the siphon into his mother's mouth. Her arms would invariably stiffen at her sides, fingers raking the bedspread as though doing so might prevent her from floating away. It seemed to be her final act, and Oliver could not tear himself from the desperate movements of those hands, knowing that when they stilled, she would be gone. He had never been quick to anger, but on one particular occasion, he could not stop the rage that ignited within him. He rushed headlong into the room, uttering obscenities he would never dare express in front of his mother. But in this instance, not caring, certain she would understand, until he came to a huffing halt a few inches from the dust child. He hoped this close proximity would scare the thing off, but its focus remained unwavering. Shifting his attention to his mother, Oliver was startled to discover that her eyes were open and her expression was serene. She was staring at the dust child as though it were Oliver himself, her expression brimming with emotion. Nearly everything about her reminded him of the way she had been before the treatments.
Mom, it's me.
He said, hoping to break the spell.
It's Ollie. I'm right here.
Her expression abruptly collapsed under a racking cough, each outburst sending a plume of dust into the air. The siphon shifted in a surprisingly fluid way, and as her cough subsided, she lifted a weak hand to caress the dusty feed arm, rubbing its surface gently with her thumb. The gesture enraged Oliver, and in a burst of renewed anger, he screamed and leapt at the dust child, pummeling it like the tyrants did to him at school.
Ah!
His entire body was encased in dust, and he began choking so violently he fell to his knees. He felt dizzy and on the verge of passing out, but he did his best to shake it off. His mother was calling for him now, her voice distant and frail. Oliver pulled himself up, standing directly where the dust child had been. His cough lingered, though he controlled it as best he could. While he was proud of what he had accomplished, he wondered if he had truly put an end to any of it. Brushing the thick residue from his face, he parted his hair in an attempt to make himself look more presentable. In an instant, his mother's expression changed from joy to disbelief. Oliver could tell by the look in her eyes and her quivering upper lip that she was seeing something else standing there, not him. "You're not my Ollie," she said, uttering the words 3 more times before Oliver bolted from the room. His tears made a mess of all the dust still clinging to his face, and as it began to gather in his eyes, he couldn't stop blinking. He leapt into bed, deep beneath the covers, shivering and muttering until his father returned. The next morning, he stayed in his room longer than usual. When his father checked on him, Oliver made a convincing plea as to how horrible he felt, and in the end was allowed to stay home from school. It was partially true, because he still had a lingering sore throat from the dust he had inhaled. And while he felt certain he could have made it through the school day, he remained fearful that if he left the house, something bad would happen. Only after his father had left for work did Oliver enter the room, hopeful that his mother would not turn on him as she had during the previous visit. Thankfully, she was overjoyed to see him. Not only that, but she appeared to have regained more energy. She motioned for him to come closer. "Your father said you're not feeling well."
Getting a cold, I think.
He had brought along a few paperbacks, and after setting these on the nightstand, he climbed into bed and lay beside her. "How are you really feeling, sweetie?" Oliver tried to push his emotions aside and offer up a stock response, but instead broke down and began to cry. He didn't know what he was going to do when she was gone, that he didn't think he could live a moment without her. "I'm not going anywhere, Ollie," she said, inching herself more erect. "Trust me on that, okay? I'm going to beat this thing, and you're gonna help." For a moment, Oliver thought she was referring to the dust child, that she had known of its existence all along. But he soon came to the realization that she was talking about the cancer and nothing more, about the thing neither of them could see, and he hardly understood.
There's something I need to tell you, Mom,
Oliver said, wanting but unable to describe what he had witnessed yesterday. When she encouraged him to continue, he faltered, knowing she would never believe him. Instead, he asked if he could read to her. She nodded, and he picked up one of the paperbacks and began fanning through its pages. He started the first chapter, savoring the odor of its newly printed ink. Such a ritual always cheered him up. "Honey," his mother interrupted after the first page had been read. "Why did you tell your father you were sick today, when you aren't?" Oliver flushed. His mother had always been able to see beneath his skin, so to speak, to understand how he was feeling, and even now, in her debilitated state, she knew the truth and was calling him on it. "You wanted to keep me safe, didn't you?" Her smile was so full of life, Well, I'll keep your secret for today, I promise. But I don't want you missing out on school. So, tomorrow you'll be better, okay? Oliver nodded reluctantly, thinking about all the things that were wrong with that idea and dreading the moment he would have to leave her behind. She would be all alone if the dust child returned, as he suspected it would. And this time, it would likely complete its task. As hard as it was to imagine, his mother's days were numbered. "What's wrong, Ollie?" Her expression had shifted to concern. Oliver couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he held the book. He set it aside and tucked into his knees in an attempt to smother his emotions. A few seconds later, he felt his mother's palm on his back, rubbing gently between his shoulders, whispering, "Everything will be okay. It really will." But it wasn't okay, not by any stretch of the imagination. Oliver did what his mother wanted, venturing to school the following day in a daze, slogging through the minutes as though each bore an hour's weight, his thoughts continually on his mother's well-being, knowing that leaving her alone was equivalent to his having passed a death sentence. Numerous horrible scenarios filled his mind, and more than once his teachers asked if he was okay, if he needed to visit the nurse. He had bowed to his mother's wishes, and now he hated himself for it. Why hadn't he explained the real reason for wanting to remain at home? Would that have been so difficult? And who could say that she wouldn't have believed him? Then again, maybe she wanted to be alone with the dust child. The idea infuriated him, particularly when he recalled the adoring expression she had shared with the thing. At the final bell, Oliver leapt to his feet, feeling as though it was more than the end of another school day. Something had happened at home. He felt anxious all day, and by the time he stepped through the front door, he was drained. Stifling his emotions, he peered into his mother's room. The dust child was nowhere in sight. In the area where it normally stood, dust drifted lazily through the muted light. Oliver walked around the bed, running a hand along the dusty dresser and spreading the residue across his forehead. Near the window, he searched the floor, expecting to discover the dust child collapsed in a pile of refuse, waiting to be swept away. But there was nothing. He didn't even sense the thing's presence, whereas in the past, it had seemed to haunt the darkest parts of the room. Oliver turned his attention to his mother. She looked so peaceful, lying there with her head angled tranquilly on the pillow. Had her eyes been open, she would have stared directly at him. But they were closed and unmoving. He stooped over, listening for breath, but knowing the last of it had likely expired as the school bell had begun to toll. The bedspread was covered by a thick layer of dust, an impossible accumulation. As Oliver placed his palms on the surface, particles began to stick to his flesh as though magnetized, as though they were, and always had been, a part of him. He swiped at the surface of the spread as if it were a dust-coated mirror, wherein memories and reflections waited to be revealed. In time, Oliver began coating himself with dust, cupping it into each palm and painting his face, clothes, and hair, not stopping until every portion of his body was shimmering. Satisfied with his work, he shifted his attention to his mother, waiting for her to open her eyes to see what he had become. When she did not, he knew exactly what he needed to do. Leaning close, he inserted 2 dusty fingers into her mouth and waited. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there before a disturbance shattered his focus and forced him to gaze slowly, dispassionately, towards the door. A figure was silhouetted there, calling to him in a familiar voice,
Ollie!
a voice that rose in desperation
Ollie!
and would not cease repeating his name
Ollie!
over and over again.
Ollie!
But he ignored it and returned to his mother, continuing to tend to her until he could no longer, until something grasped his shoulders and yanked him back, and he began to drift like so much dust away from her, so very far away.
Thank you for listening to Horror Tales. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm a music composer and sound designer. You can commission an original score or sound design for your own project on horrortalespodcast.com. That is horrortalespodcast.com. A huge thank you to C.M. Mueller for contributing the story The Dust Child. This story is part of his anthology Hidden Folk, and you can learn more about C.M. Mueller's work at chtonicmatter.wordpress.com. That is CHTHONIC matter.wordpress.com. Also, a huge thank you to Allyson Latondress who narrated the story. You can follow Allyson Latondress on Twitter under @LatondressVO. That is @LATONDRESSVO on Twitter. And also a special thank you to Seth Juvland playing Ollie and Joe Juvland playing the father. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let's meet again on the next episode of Horror Tales.
That's it? Yep. We did it?
We did it.